K9 dog was deemed uncontrollable until a blind boy whispered a word. The kennels behind the precinct trembled with sound metal bowls rattling, claws skittering, voices low with frustration. Snow hissed against the floodlights outside, casting a sterile glow on the corridor where officers came and went with tight jaws and tired eyes. At the end of that corridor, in a reinforced run lined with bite-scarred steel, a German shepherd paced like a storm contained. Titan, the dog every handler had once called promising, the dog no one would touch now. He hit the gate with his shoulder again, lips peeled, a serrated growl vibrating through his chest. The nameplate on the door clanged against the mesh. "Back," Sergeant Miller warned, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen hardened men retreat from that stare, that coiled, wounded rage born of a botched narcotics raid and too many hours in isolation. The talk had turned ugly. Retirement to a quiet farm if he was lucky, euthanasia if he wasn't. Down the hall, a cane ticked softly against the rubber floor. Daniel Grady, 9 years old, winter hat pulled low, milk-pale eyes that saw nothing and somehow saw everything, walked with one hand on his father's sleeve. Officer Grady's mouth was a hard line. "We look from the walkway and we leave," he murmured. "No closer." Daniel nodded, listening to the air itself, the shift of boots, the metallic echo, the breath that wasn't human. They reached the run. Titan slammed the door, teeth flashing. Officers flinched. Daniel didn't. He tilted his head as if catching a frequency everyone else missed and slipped his cane under his arm. "He's not angry," Daniel said softly. "He's scared." "Daniel," Grady warned, reaching for him. But the boy had already stepped forward until the cold of the mesh kissed his knuckles. The corridor held its breath. Titan froze mid-pace, pupils razored, chest heaving. For a long, dangerous second, nothing moved. Then Daniel raised his hand, palm open, trembling only a little, and breathed a single word so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "Friend." Something broke not in the boy, not in the officers, but in the dog. The growl fractured into a whine. Titan's head dropped. He edged forward, breath fogging the mesh, and pressed his nose into the small, waiting hand. The corridor exhaled. Sergeant Miller swore under his breath. Officer Grady's eyes filled, and Daniel, smiling like dawn inside a fluorescent night, whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to fight me." What happened next would spread through the precinct like a miracle and force everyone to ask what they'd missed when they looked with fear instead of faith. The precinct in Winter Haven wasn't large, just a 2-story brick building pressed against the river, its lot bordered by chain-link fencing and snowdrifts. It smelled of wet boots, cheap coffee, and the faint musk of working dogs. Most officers passed through the kennels quickly, avoiding the last run where Titan lived like a prisoner with no trial. Titan had once been the pride of the K9 unit. A German shepherd bred for stamina and intelligence, he had finished his early training with near-perfect scores. He could track a suspect across frozen woods, detect narcotics in a half-second sweep, and hold a decoy in a bite suit with precision that impressed even veterans. Sergeant Miller had called him a once-in-a-decade dog. But after the narcotics raid gone wrong, an explosion of glass, shouting, a handler injured Titan, had been left in the back of a van for hours. When they pulled him out, something inside him had shifted. The playful pup they remembered was gone. In his place stood a soldier on edge, bristling at every approach. Trainers tried positive reinforcement, new routines, even medication. Each attempt ended the same. Titan lunging at the gate, snarling, refusing food until he collapsed with exhaustion. Some whispered he was broken. Others muttered that a dangerous animal couldn't be trusted among civilians. Sergeant Miller, though reluctant, began paperwork for retirement. It was into this tense atmosphere that Daniel Grady wandered like an unlikely intruder. 9 years old, hair the color of wheat, skin marked by the faint paleness of someone who didn't see the sun much. His world was stitched together not with sights, but with sounds, the scrape of a boot, the rattle of a chain, the way silence bent when someone was holding their breath. Born blind, Daniel had never once described himself as unlucky. He simply said he listened with his whole face. His father, Officer Grady, had been with the K-9 unit for over a decade. Widowed after his wife's long illness, he tried to balance work and parenthood, bringing Daniel to the precinct when babysitters fell through. Most officers had grown fond of the boy's quiet presence, his cane tapping gently against the floors. He learned the names of every dog by their bark. He could tell when someone was smiling just by the change in their voice. But the kennel wing was usually off limits. Not because Daniel was fragile, he wasn't, but because of Titan. Everyone knew the shepherd had become unpredictable, a liability. Grady had kept his son away, fearing the day Daniel would ask the inevitable question. That day came on a Thursday afternoon. The air smelled of snow, and the river outside was locked in ice. Daniel sat in the break room, his fingers trailing over a chessboard one of the officers had given him. His father, reviewing reports, barely looked up when Daniel asked, "Dad, what's wrong with the dog at the end?" Grady froze. "What makes you think something's wrong?" "He doesn't sound like the others," Daniel replied simply. "The others bark when they want attention. He growls like he's waiting for something that never comes." The room went quiet. Sergeant Miller, passing through, stopped with his coffee halfway to his lips. "The kid's sharper than half of us," he muttered. Daniel turned his pale eyes toward the sound of his father's breathing. "Can I meet him?" "No," Grady answered too quickly. "It isn't safe." Daniel didn't flinch. "He's not mean, just scared. People sound different when they're scared. So do dogs." It wasn't defiance in his voice, but conviction. And in that conviction, Grady heard echoes of his late wife, the same stubborn compassion that had driven her to foster stray animals, to teach their son that blindness wasn't weakness. His throat tightened. Miller shook his head. "That shepherd will eat anyone who steps close. He's lost, Grady. Don't put the boy in danger." But Daniel lifted his chin, his hands folded neatly over the head of his cane. "He's not lost. He's waiting for someone who will listen." The words hung like frost in the air. Grady looked at Miller, then at the closed door leading to the kennel wing. His instincts, as a father, screamed no, but something else, a flicker of belief, maybe hope, made him hesitate. "All right," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "But you stay behind me. If he lunges, we leave. Understood?" Daniel nodded once. And so, on that brittle winter afternoon, a blind boy with nothing but a cane and a heart too big for his small frame stepped into the place where hardened officers feared to tread. The echo of Titan's growl rolled down the corridor as they approached, a warning to every soul who dared come closer. Yet Daniel walked without fear, guided not by sight, but by something deeper, an unshakable certainty that even the most broken warrior could be called back by a single word. The kennel corridor, was colder than the rest of the precinct, lined with concrete and steel, the air heavy with disinfectant and animal musk. Dogs barked from their runs as Officer Grady and Sergeant Miller escorted Daniel past, but one voice rose above all the others, low, guttural, alive with rage. Titan! The German shepherd hurled himself at the bars, claws scraping, teeth bared in a flash of ivory. His muscles coiled with such violence that even Miller stepped back, muttering, "That's not a dog, that's a bomb with fur." But Daniel didn't retreat. He tilted his head, listening past the noise, past the sharp barks ricocheting off the walls, until all he heard was Titan's breathing, quick, jagged, uneven, fear disguised as fury. "Dad?" Daniel whispered. "Yes, son?" "Take me closer." Grady hesitated, his pulse hammering in his throat. Titan's hackles were high, saliva glinting on the mesh. It went against every instinct, every policy he'd ever learned. But the boy's voice carried a strange calm. Against his better judgment, Grady guided Daniel a step forward. Titan's snarl deepened, vibrating through the steel. Daniel raised his hand, palm open, as if greeting a friend. The room seemed to freeze. Miller hissed, "Pull him back!" But Daniel leaned slightly forward, his face turned toward the sound of the dog's rage. "You don't have to scare me," he said softly. His words weren't commands, weren't coaxing. They were truth spoken like prayer. Titan's ears flicked. The growl faltered, replaced by a sharp whine. His body stilled. For the first time in months, he didn't strike the gate. He edged forward, nose quivering, breath steaming in the cold air. Daniel whispered one word, so gentle that only Titan seemed to hear it. "Friend." The effect was immediate. Titan pressed his nose against the mesh, hot breath against the boy's small palm. The growl dissolved into a sound that none of them had expected, a low, keening whimper, almost an apology. Grady's chest tightened. His knees wanted to give. He'd seen hardened suspects break under interrogation, but nothing compared to the sight of this dog once deemed uncontrollable, bowing his head to a blind child. Daniel crouched, letting his cane rest across his lap. Titan mirrored him, lowering to the ground until their faces were level, only steel between them. Daniel's hand brushed through the bars, fingertips grazing coarse fur. Titan flinched, but didn't pull away. He exhaled a long, trembling sigh, and then unbelievably rested his massive head against the bars, surrendering his weight to the boy's touch. "It's okay," Daniel murmured, stroking behind his ear. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Officers had gathered silently down the hall, drawn by the absence of noise. They stared as Titan, the menace of the kennels, lay still as stone, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Sergeant Miller rubbed a hand over his face. "In 20 years, he muttered, "I've never seen anything like that." Grady couldn't speak. His throat burned with pride, fear, and awe tangled together. His son, the boy who couldn't see, had just glimpsed something in Titan no one else had. When Daniel finally stood, Titan whined softly, as if begging him not to leave. Daniel smiled, his pale eyes turned toward the warmth of the dog's breath. "I'll come back," he promised. And as they left, the kennel didn't echo with snarls. It echoed with silence, heavy, astonished silence. The dog they had nearly given up on had chosen trust again, and it had taken nothing more than the hand of a child who could not see but somehow understood everything. Snow fell heavy that winter in Winter Haven, blanketing the town in quiet, but inside the kennels the silence never lasted. Titan's story, pieced together from reports and the murmurs of handlers was one that few wanted to speak aloud. Before the raid that broke him, Titan had been flawless. He had been bred from a line of working champions, trained from the time his ears were still floppy. Officers spoke of the way he'd bound over obstacles, nose to the ground, tracking a fugitive with almost supernatural precision. They told stories of his obedience. One word, and he'd sit, another, and he'd guard. But in the raid 6 months ago, something had gone terribly wrong. It had been meant to be routine. A meth lab bust in a derelict house on the edge of the river. Titan's handler had led him through a broken door when a flashbang detonated prematurely. The explosion wasn't fatal, but the shockwave rattled windows for blocks and sent Titan's handler to the ground with shattered eardrums. In the chaos, Titan had been shoved into a steel cage in the back of a transport van. Hours passed before anyone remembered him there. Alone, ears ringing, the scent of burning chemicals choking his lungs, Titan had paced until his claws bled. By the time they opened the door, the dog that leapt out wasn't the one who had gone in. His trust in commands had fractured. His trust in people had nearly vanished. Officers who approached after that described his eyes as wild. He wouldn't eat if a human was near. He lunged at gates, snapped at trainers, shredded blankets. What none of them saw was the memory Titan carried, a flash of fire, the sudden absence of the handler he trusted most, and the long, suffocating hours of being forgotten. To Titan, people meant betrayal. The kennel meant prison. The world had turned hostile, and yet Daniel walked into that same world without hesitation. His own life had been shaped by shadows, but of a different kind. Blind since birth, Daniel had known no colors, no shapes. His memories were made of textures and sounds, the rhythm of his father's boots on hardwood floors, the whisper of his mother's voice reading him to sleep, the cool surface of a chessboard under his fingertips. When his mother died 2 years earlier, after a long fight with illness, Daniel's world shifted. He had never seen her face, but he remembered her laugh, how it vibrated through the kitchen when she tried to sing while cooking. He remembered the way her hand fit around his as she guided him through the garden, naming flowers he would never see but always imagine. Losing her left a silence in the house that even the ticking of the clock couldn't fill. His father did his best, but grief carved sharp edges into Officer Grady. He buried himself in work, in the unit, in the endless cycle of reports and late nights. Daniel, too perceptive for his age, sensed the gap but never complained. Instead, he learned to navigate by listening harder, stretching his hearing into places most people ignored. When classmates mocked him for his cane, he smiled and asked them to close their eyes for 5 minutes to see if they could find the exit. He lived with dignity, but loneliness often pressed on his small shoulders. That was why, when he first heard Titan's growl in the distance, something about it rang familiar. To most, it was menace. To Daniel, it was recognition. That sound wasn't anger, it was grief made audible. Grady remembered his late wife's compassion, the way she once told him, "Daniel doesn't see the world, he feels it. He'll notice things the rest of us miss." She had been right. Where hardened men saw a monster, Daniel heard a broken soldier. The bond that sparked in the kennel was no accident. Titan, abandoned by his handler and trapped in his trauma, had met a boy who also knew the sting of loss, who also lived in a world shaped by absence. Titan had flinched from every human hand except Daniel's because Daniel's touch carried no expectation, no judgment. Just the steady warmth of someone who didn't want to command, only to comfort. In the days that followed their first meeting, Titan's transformation stunned the precinct. Daniel came back every afternoon after school. He would sit cross-legged on the cold concrete, his cane across his knees, and hum tuneless melodies under his breath. Titan would pace at first, uncertain, then circle closer until his body was pressed against the bars. Sometimes Daniel whispered stories, half-remembered tales his mother used to tell. Sometimes he said nothing at all, just rested his hand on Titan's fur, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. The officers noticed the change. Titan no longer hurled himself at the gate when someone passed. His growls softened into rumbles, his eyes calmer. For the first time since the raid, he accepted food from a handler's hand so long as Daniel was nearby. Yet not everyone believed. Sergeant Miller shook his head. A dangerous dog is still dangerous. One boy doesn't erase what he's done. Others murmured agreement. Titan had scared too many, come too close to hurting someone. They feared trusting him again. But Grady watched closely. He saw the way Titan leaned into Daniel's touch, how the dog seemed to anchor himself in the boy's presence. He saw his son, once so quiet since his mother's death, laugh again when Titan licked his palm. Something was healing not just the dog, but the boy. Their tragedies mirrored each other. Titan had lost his handler in a flash of chaos. Daniel had lost his mother in the slow drip of illness. Both had been left behind by the people they trusted most. And both had found in each other the fragile beginnings of a new kind of family. It happened on a day when no one expected trouble. Snow was melting, the river swelling with icy runoff. Daniel was in the precinct yard, cane across his lap as he sat on the training benches. Titan, now allowed into the exercise field under close supervision, paced with nervous energy. His ears flicked constantly, but when Daniel called softly, he always came back to press his shoulder against the boy's knees, steadying himself in that contact. Sergeant Miller stood near the fence, arms folded. "He's calmer, I'll give him that," he muttered, "but calm isn't the same as safe." Before Grady could respond, the screech of tires tore through the air. A black pickup swerved into the lot, engine roaring. Its driver, a wiry man in a heavy coat, jumped out with a pistol in his hand. Shouts erupted. Officers scrambled, but the gunman moved fast, vaulting the fence into the yard straight toward the boy on the bench. Daniel froze at the sound of the intrusion, his ears sharp, but his body unprepared. The man seized his arm, yanking him upright. "Nobody move!" the intruder barked, the pistol jammed against Daniel's ribs. "I'll kill the kid if anyone follows." It was chaos. Guns raised, shouts overlapping, officers caught between protecting Daniel and avoiding a shot that could end his life. Grady's face drained of color. "Daniel!" he choked, every muscle locked. And then Titan moved. For a heartbeat, the shepherd stood utterly still, amber eyes blazing, every line of his body taut with focus. Officers shouted for him to heal, to stay, but Titan wasn't listening. He saw only the boy who had whispered friend, who had touched him without fear. The intruder dragged Daniel backward toward the fence, shouting threats. But he hadn't accounted for Titan's speed. With a roar that split the air, the shepherd launched forward. His body was a missile of fur and muscle, his jaws locking onto the man's wrist before he could fire. The pistol discharged once into the ground, dirt spraying, but Titan held fast, teeth sinking until the gun clattered away. The man screamed, thrashing, But Titan's grip didn't falter. Officers rushed in, pinning the intruder, tearing him away from Daniel. Titan released only when Daniel's trembling hand brushed his shoulder, his quiet voice anchoring him again. "It's okay, Titan. I'm okay." Silence fell over the yard. The intruder was cuffed, blood streaking his sleeve, curses spilling from his mouth. But no one looked at him. Every eye was on the shepherd pressed against Daniel, tail lashing, chest heaving. He had not attacked out of rage. He had struck with precision, saving the boy without leaving more than a torn arm on the man who threatened him. Sergeant Miller exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. His voice cracked. That was a textbook disarm. Officer Grady dropped to his knees, arms wrapping around his son. Daniel clung to him, valor pressed between them, the three a tangled knot of relief and tears. "I told you," Daniel whispered against his father's shoulder, his voice shaky but sure. "He's not bad. He just needed someone to believe him." The precinct yard buzzed with voices, some in disbelief, others in awe. What no training manual, no professional handler, no medication had been able to repair Daniel had. By giving Titan one word, one promise, the boy had unlocked the dog's loyalty in its purest form. Later, when the danger had passed and the yard emptied, Miller approached Grady. His tone was quiet, humbled. "I was wrong. That dog doesn't belong in a cage. He belongs out there working, protecting. He just needed his partner to find him again." Grady looked at his son, and the dog curled at his feet, Daniel's pale hand resting on Titan's neck. He nodded slowly. Maybe he already has. Winter Haven still buzzed with talk of the yard incident. Some called it luck, others miracle. But for Daniel and Titan, it was only the beginning. A week later, the precinct received word of a man barricaded inside a warehouse near the river, armed, desperate, and with hostages. The SWAT team rolled in, every officer on edge. Among them was Grady, his son left at home, but his thoughts never straying far. Titan had been cleared for a test to see if he could work again in the field. Miller argued against it, but the captain gave one chance. The warehouse loomed, windows dark, snow whipping around its skeletal frame. Shots cracked inside. The team prepared to breach. Titan bristled at the noise, ears swiveling. His handler tried to hold him steady, but his eyes flicked toward the door, toward the chaos beyond, as if remembering the raid that broke him. For a moment, he trembled, caught between memory and command. Then a voice carried through the radio, faint but clear, Daniel's voice. Grady had patched in his son for this moment alone. "It's okay, Titan," the boy said, calm as a prayer. "You're not alone anymore. Go be brave, friend." The shepherd's trembling stilled. His breath steadied. When the door blew, Titan shot forward, not wild, not reckless, but sharp and precise. He raced through the smoke, past overturned crates, straight toward the gunman dragging a hostage toward the exit. The man swung his weapon up. Too late. Titan hit him square in the chest, the gun skittering across the concrete. The hostage scrambled free as officers swarmed, but all eyes were on the shepherd pinning the suspect with a grip that was firm, controlled, and unbreakable. "Release!" the handler barked. Titan obeyed instantly, stepping back with his chest heaving, but his eyes steady. No frenzy, no rage, only discipline, only trust. The warehouse erupted in shouts and sirens, but the loudest sound in Grady's ears was his own heartbeat. The dog they had once called Uncontrollable had just saved a life and followed orders to perfection. When Titan returned, tail wagging hesitantly, Grady dropped to his knees, and buried a hand in his fur. "You did it," he whispered, though he knew the credit wasn't his. Daniel's words had carried Titan across the line no handler could. Back at the precinct, Miller stood with folded arms, his face unreadable. At last he said, "That wasn't just a dog out there. That was a partner, and we almost threw him away." Later that night, when Titan padded into the Grady home, Daniel was waiting on the floor, Kane resting beside him. The shepherd bounded to him, pressing his head into the boy's chest. Daniel wrapped his arms around the thick neck, whispering into his ear, "See, I told you, you were never broken. You just needed someone to listen." For a long moment, the dog stayed like that, leaning into the boy's embrace as if it was the only anchor in the world. Grady stood in the doorway, eyes wet, realizing that redemption had come not from training manuals or force, but from a child who couldn't see the scars, only the soul. Titan wasn't just back, he was reborn. Spring arrived in Winter Haven with the slow thaw of ice along the river and the return of birdsong to the trees. At the precinct, a ceremony was held in the courtyard, the kind reserved for heroes. Rows of officers stood in dress uniform, families gathered with cameras ready, and at the center of it all was a German shepherd sitting tall, eyes bright, tail sweeping the ground like a quiet drumbeat. Titan. He wore a new leather collar, embossed with a polished badge, K9 Titan, partner, protector, friend. Daniel stood beside him, his cane tucked under one arm, his free hand resting on Titan's shoulders. The boy couldn't see the flashes of cameras or the proud tears shining in hardened eyes, but he felt everything. The warmth of the dog pressed to him, the steady hum of voices, the way the world seemed to be smiling. Captain Harris stepped forward. 6 months ago, this dog was considered unfit for duty. Some called him dangerous, others called him lost. But today, we recognize that what was broken has been restored and stronger than ever. He turned, voice steady but thick with emotion. And we owe it not just to the officers who never gave up, but to one boy who reminded us all what loyalty truly means. Applause filled the courtyard, rolling like thunder. Titan barked once, sharp and proud, earning laughter from the crowd. Daniel grinned, bending low to whisper, "They're clapping for you, you know." Titan nuzzled his chest, the badge on his collar glinting in the sun. From that day forward, Titan was not just another K9. He became a symbol in Winter Haven. Children wrote letters to the precinct, calling him the dog who found his friend. Officers spoke of him with respect, not fear. And when Titan returned to patrol, he worked with precision and heart, but always returned home at night to the boy who had saved him with a single whispered word. Daniel, too, changed. No longer just the quiet son of a widowed officer, he became the boy who healed the dog no one could reach. The boy who showed an entire town that sometimes the bravest eyes are the ones that cannot see. Years later, when people asked about Titan's turnaround, Sergeant Miller would shake his head with a smile. It wasn't us. It wasn't training. It was the kid and one word. Because not every hero wears a badge. Some walk on 4 legs, some carry a cane, and sometimes all it takes to bring them together is the courage to whisper, "Friend."